Welcome to today's booth talk at COP16. I'm here today with Klein from the Environment Institute. He'll be talking about which countries are particularly vulnerable. And this is a question that is quite germane to the ongoing negotiations here at COP. Richard.
Thank you, Clarisse. Which countries are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change? It seems a simple question. You think of Bangladesh, Maldives, Peru and other poor countries that face consequences of climate change, be it sea level rise, be it water scarcity, be it floods and droughts. But in reality you're really comparing apples and oranges, because which country is more vulnerable, Mali or Mexico, Vietnam or Vanuatu? Is Mali more vulnerable because it's poorer than Mexico and already affected by drought, or is Mexico more vulnerable because more economic assets are at risk? Countries have been struggling with this question of which countries are particularly vulnerable because the answer to this would help them prioritize which countries actually get adaptation finance, get prioritized for adaptation finance. And this is clearly a political question. Countries, you would think that countries don't want to be particularly vulnerable, but in this case, being labeled as such gives them priority to receive adaptation finance.
What kind of money are we talking about?
The adaptation fund at the moment and other sources of adaptation are currently in the order of several hundreds of millions of US dollars, with the expectation after Copenhagen and Cancun is that this will increase to several billions of US dollars. So there needs to be a fair and sensible way of dividing and prioritizing that money to those countries that are particularly vulnerable.
What do we know about definitions of particularly vulnerable? Has anybody put something forward that begins to define them?
Yes, that's part of the problem. There are several definitions of particularly vulnerable. The convention itself lists in the preamble different groups of countries. Then in a different article, 4.8, there's a different grouping of countries again. Then the Bali Action Plan agreed 3 years ago to lead up the negotiations to Copenhagen, again has a different definition, which is more political, and that one is currently being looked at. It lists the least developed countries, the small island states, and countries in Africa affected by drought as particularly vulnerable. And this is seen as a problem by particularly Latin American countries and countries in Asia, which are not small island states, which are not least developed countries, and which obviously are not in Africa. And they feel they are being left out, even though they feel that their particular circumstances would qualify them as particularly vulnerable.
How do we resolve this? I think there's a sense among many people that somehow we can come up with a scientific formula that will make this all work.
Yes, there have been calls for what is called a vulnerability index. That means you take different data of factors that determine your vulnerability, be it poverty, institutional capacity, exposure to climate impact, combine that into a number, and if you have a number for each country, you could rank the countries according to their level of vulnerability. In fact, that's been done by different organizations. This year, for example, Maplecroft came up with a vulnerability index, a DARA report that was published here in Cancun, and there are other studies underway. The interesting thing is that they all take a different approach, and they all come up with a different outcome of which country is the most vulnerable and which countries are particularly vulnerable. That means that the results are not necessarily reliable, and that countries that are higher ranked in one index may be less high ranked in another index. So negotiators have no idea how to actually use that kind of information.
Does this mean that if the United States reads one report and Germany reads a different report, they might have entirely different priorities?
Exactly. They have a different understanding of what it is that is particularly vulnerable, which countries need to be prioritized, and those countries that are not prioritized according to one index might be prioritized according to another index, and that clearly creates confusion and an inability to move forward on adaptation finance.
Some countries have probably had more capacity or done better than others to respond to their vulnerabilities and address those vulnerabilities. Is that taken into account when vulnerability is being assessed?
Surprisingly, one of the two that I just mentioned does, the other one does not. So if you take the example of Bangladesh, Bangladesh has made a lot of progress in the past few years of reducing its vulnerability. Its civil society and government have been very active, also given recent events, and they've been effective in reducing their vulnerability. That's being taken into account by one study, and therefore they are considered to be less vulnerable and therefore less prioritized for adaptation finance. The other study does not take that into account and considers Bangladesh, given its exposure to cyclones and sea level rise, as particularly vulnerable.
So, what is happening in Cancun right now with relation to vulnerability?
In the negotiations on adaptation, there are a number of issues that are still unresolved. The definition of vulnerability is one of them. The information I have is that this is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon, and it's likely that it is still on the agenda next year in Durban.
What can happen between now and Durban to really solve this issue once and for all?
Ideally, you would get negotiators to understand that assessing vulnerability and developing a vulnerability index is really a political exercise and not one that you can hand out to experts, where you can expect experts to come up with one universally accepted truth about vulnerability. Different experts have different interpretations of what makes a country vulnerable, and therefore they come up with different numbers and different recommendations on who should be prioritized. What is needed is that the politicians themselves, the negotiators themselves, take the initiative and agree on which factors need to be considered, be it the level of exposure to climate impact, be it the level of poverty, be it institutional aspects, and they can then be combined in a way that has been agreed by parties beforehand, rather than agree on take an index and try to reach agreement about numbers that are at best intransparent and at worst pseudo-scientific.
There has been some different suggestions on who should make that political decision, including that some of the developing countries should get together and hash it out amongst themselves. Do you think that that is the right approach, or are the people funding it the ones who should be deciding?
Well, in principle, when something gets decided by the COP, it's all countries that have to agree with one another, although this is very much an issue between the developing countries themselves, where the least developed countries and the small island states prefer one particular definition of particular vulnerability, and Latin American and Asian countries prefer another definition. So the developed countries are part of those discussions. They don't really have a strong opinion. They, in a way, are comfortable with the fact that this hasn't been resolved yet, because that takes pressure off them to start financing adaptation according to that definition. This is really an issue between the developing countries, and they need to sort this out among themselves.
What is happening at the same time with vulnerability? Is the need actually holding stable, or are you seeing more and more countries that are finding reasons why they should be deemed particularly vulnerable?
Well, clearly talking about vulnerability isn't doing anything to reduce vulnerability. And vulnerability is increasing as climate change happens and poverty is not addressed. There are, again, countries this year as well who argue that they are particularly vulnerable. They've got their own reasons for that. I believe this year it was Iran that argued in plenary that they are particularly vulnerable because of their exposure to dust storms. Pakistan has argued last time around that they are particularly vulnerable because they are obviously very much affected by floods. Turkey at some point argued that they are particularly vulnerable. It becomes a bit of a beauty contest as to which countries are particularly vulnerable. And that can happen in the absence of an agreed definition and an agreed way of calculating it.
Questions from the audience?
Where are the different kinds of definitions currently coming from? Can you cite some sources?
Yes, I can cite it from our policy brief that I'm happy to give. We have a policy brief, SEI policy brief, on which countries are particularly vulnerable. Science doesn't have the answer, and it includes detailed description of the various definitions that we have. Let me just cite, I mentioned the preamble from the UNFCCC, which talks about low-lying and other small island countries. countries with low-lying coastal, arid and semi-arid areas or areas liable to floods, drought or desertification, and developing countries with fragile mountainous ecosystems. That then is further developed in Article 4.8. It has a listing, 9 different types of countries, which are basically all based on their geographical characteristics. Then, as I mentioned in the Bali Action Plan, it was more political grouping of the least developed countries, the small island states and countries in Africa affected by drought. In Copenhagen, this was further developed and argued that other countries could be part of this as well. If you take them all together, you end up with a list of more than 100 countries. So the value of which is actually particularly vulnerable then disappears. One could also argue that this is an important question because there isn't sufficient amount of funding available. If there were more adaptation finance available to distribute to more countries, the need to prioritize on the basis of particularly vulnerable wouldn't be quite as big. I'm happy to give this policy brief to you so you can have a look.
But how do you foresee the negotiations in this regard? I mean, there is already now some sort of tension among developing countries on the definition.
Yes.
So how do you foresee the negotiations and the upcoming negotiations?
At the moment, it seems like there is a real gridlock in the negotiations about developing countries can't agree among themselves. And I think what is necessary is that representatives from the different groupings sit together and try and work out a sensible approach forward to reach agreement in Durban. There are 4 different options to deal with particular vulnerability in the text that's under negotiation at the moment. I don't expect that there will be an agreement about this here, but there might be agreement about how to resolve this between now and Durban.
What are these options? The 4 different options?
Say again?
The 4 different options?
There are 4 different options in the text at the moment.
What are these?
One is to leave it undefined. One is to take the preambular text, that means the one that I just read out. One is the Bali Action Plan text, and one is a combination of the two.
So Richard, one last question. Do you have a sense of how much money would be needed to provide adaptation funds to all the countries that qualify under these different categories of particularly vulnerable?
Yes, there are different assessments of the investment needs in developing countries to address the adaptation challenge. They range from about 10 to more than $100 billion per year by 2015, 2020.
Do you expect that at any point that kind of money will be available?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.